Okay, so let's get started. Today's agenda is going to be the following. I'm going to recap the current code base of the continuous use case that we used to work on. تمام? I just added a single part, the blogs, creating blogs. تمام? Usually we had two essential use cases, register and login, or just register. So I added login, create blog posts, and view blog posts. تمام? I'm going to recap on the class diagram UML relationships. We're going to talk about something called the trade-off. تمام? How associations can reduce coupling, تمام? And how it's going to be increased from somewhere else, تمام? Because this is going to be, by the end of the day, a design decision. You cannot reduce coupling everywhere. There is going to be coupling, but you need to choose which certain area in the code that you that should be kept as loosely coupled, and the other is going to be highly coupled. تمام? We are going to refactor compositions into associations, and I really strongly recommend everyone to do this unless you have a logical relationship. Yani you have two classes and you see that the only logical relationship between a book and chapters in a book, so book and chapters, this is logically to be composition, so leave this as it is. تمام? Otherwise, if you're using composition in a scenario that doesn't really need you to use composition, just merely association, this is something that you are going to you're going to be graded on. So just keep in mind that everything is going to be running fallbacking to the default association type. We are going to talk about something called the domain objects. We are going to refactor our code into domain objects and then refactoring to layered architecture. And finally, we're going to see something called the hybrid architecture. I don't know if we're going to take enough time in this lab to finish this or not, but inshallah, optional is going to be an extra session on Wednesday. The attendance is mandatory, because not because I want to mark the attendance, but everyone needs to hear this information. Right? Wednesday at the morning. Yes, exactly. At the lab timing on Wednesday, we are going to have a follow-up session. So most of the work is going to be at the morning. Right? Okay, so let's talk about the current code base. I'm just going to show you what the current code base looks like. Okay, so let's start from add.py. Okay, well, let's start from the back. Okay, so this is your data access. Nothing is really changed here. The font is clear, so everyone can see the font, right? Type. So nothing really has changed here. تمام? The only thing that I've added, we had a search function. This search function usually returns how many subjects, how many objects. It returns one, a singular thing, whether this is an index or an object, right? Sometimes you would want to find everything, right? So if I write something like this, for example, this is equivalent to what you've taken in SQL. So this implementation of find all, if you want to implement in SQL, usually you would do something like this. To select all from user, right? And if you want to select a certain table, maybe where is going to return multiple things. So username, for example, equals certain value, right? So this is going to be returning multiple rows based on how many people are named as Ahmed. But if you want to limit it, you can just say limit one. So this is equivalent to find by, returning a single thing. And this is equivalent without the limit, equivalent to find all. I want to have all matches from the database. So this is just a list. This is going to map to people who are working on NoSQL, people who are using Firebase. I think this is going to be beneficial to you. The equivalent in SQL, anyone who's using SQL, this is the way to go. So this is the only added part in data access. Let's take a look at the logic class. And let's see how things are really done horribly in the logic class. So we decided to add a use case. This use case is essentially what? Creating blocks, right? So this is the use case. We just decided to add the first one, which is create blog posts, right? And the other one is view blog posts. And of course, there is a login. We didn't implement login together, so I just added the login here. تمام? So let's have a look here. تمام? Obviously, you know that blog is going to be represented or modeled as a class. And if we want to have some assumption for the multiplicity, we can say that a user can create multiple blogs, right? But a blog is associated with only one person, right? So this is a one-to-many relationship, right? Whether you are using NoSQL or SQL, you are going to need to know how to represent this in your models and database, right? So the multiplicity is one-to-many, and for an SQL DB rule, something that you should keep in mind, this is the golden rule in one-to-manys. If you have a many site, right? take the primary key from the one side and put it as a foreign key in the many side, right? If you don't remember, this is the way to go. تمام? So if you have a primary key in the one side, put it in the many side. That's it. Okay. So for my case, the one side is the user, right? And the many side is the blogs. But looking at this implementation, we have nothing. Like if we just take a look at the current classes, we have no accounts, no user class, and no blog class, right? So everything is so generic and is placed in one place like this in the logic class, right? So I'm just going to go with this implementation, and we are going to refactor this later on to what we call domain objects, having every related use case in users and the other related use cases for the blogs in the blog class. تمام? So we said that we need the user.json, which is essentially my database, an equivalent to the database, right? But in this case, I just need the CRUD file. تمام? So the CRUD file is essentially an object. This is composition, just to remind you. This is composition. Any call, any class name followed by two parentheses, right? This is composition. How do you know that this is composition? This is the internal call, and this is stored in an instance variable. تمام? So we created a data access object and stored it in this variable. We created a reference for the data access bot operating on the blog.json and stored it in this variable, right? So by the end of the day, we have a temporary users list and a temporary blogs list. This is the entire table of the users, and this is the entire table of the blogs. So continuing, this is the attribute for the users, right? And this is the attribute for the blog. Each blog is going to have 3 columns: title and body and author. You know where we are going to get the author value from, right? منين? From where? Yes. Now take a look at the attributes here. We said that a user, right? We said a user can have one or multiple blogs, right? So one user can have multiple blogs, and a blog is associated with one user, right? So if we say that we have 3 attributes here, title and body and author, right? Usually the author name is going to be the name of the username, the name of the user, right? So let me just say that this username and password and logged in. Okay, I don't really need logged in. By the way, logged in is something that you are going to see by default in your framework. In the framework, you're going to see a global variable that runs across the entire application that's called session. In this session variable, you can save things to use later on, right? So you can see something like logged in. You can save this attribute on the fly. You can save username. This is in Django and Flask and in Flutter and most probably in every web development framework. But I just want to emphasize on something. We said that when one-to-many, if we have a one-to-many, then you take the primary key from the, assuming that this is the primary key, the username. You take the primary key from the one side and put it in the many side as a foreign key, right? So essentially, the author is going to be the foreign key of the users, right? All right, so this is how can we associate them. If we know this information, this means that my table, my blog.json table, is going to contain how many columns? 3 columns, right? So this is the first row, this is the second row, and this is the third row, right? The first column, the second column, and the third column is essentially taken from the username, from the users. Tamam? This is your usual registration function. This is the typical user exist function, and we use user exist to check before we do the registration. Tamam? We have the get user. This is just a getter that returns something. We added the login part, and this is self-explanatory, but I'm just going to go through it really quickly. I'm just checking, do we have a username with the current username, right, or not, from the list of users, which is essentially the temporary users list, right? If we have something like this, then check on the password, right? User exists, returns the index, and returns a flag. If yes, then use the index. Use which row exactly does this user lives in, right? So check on the password. If there is, then set the current user, the current login session to be related to this guy's information, right? So setting the session is implemented or simulated by me via this function, via this setter function. Once we have someone, I'm just going to take these attributes that I initialized all by none, right? And if you find someone trying to log in, I'm just going to take the username and pass it to this set user, and the password is the same thing. And finally, I'm going to set logged in into true, right? If the password didn't match, we're going to tell him that wrong password, right? If the login is successful, then this is the flash message. If the user was not found to begin with, then we're going to tell him that you need to be registered. Tamam? Type. Finally, we have the logout, and essentially the logout is the resetting of the set user. This is the complement of set user, right? So you set everything by none back to default, and this is false. Okay, so this is just another getter function to check if the current user is logged in or not. So this returns a boolean, either true or false, based on this attribute. Tamam? Let's take a look at the blog use cases. We added the blog use cases to the same class, which is, it is way too much. Like, see, this class itself, it has like 200 lines, almost 200 lines, and it's not even it should not be like this. It's not cohesive. It has so many things all over the place. Tamam? It doesn't mean that I ask you to do classes and object oriented to just create one class and dump every use case inside of it. Everything needs to be related to the domain object, to the class that it represents. معايا? طيب. So take a look at the create blog post. Create a blog post takes the input. I don't care if the input is coming from the terminal, if it's coming from a form from the web, but you take the title and you take the body, you assign these two things. And finally, this current user who is currently logged in, I'm going to take the username from him, right? From the current logged in session. Take this username and place it in the author field, right? To do this is essentially placing the foreign key or linking the two objects together, okay? Finally, we're going to append the new row into the list of temporary blogs, right? And we are going to write this or save this into the database. This is equivalent in Django by saying something like .save or model.save or Flask. It's the same thing, yeah. Tamam? There is another function that all that it does is that it represents, it fetches all blogs from the database. So knowing that I have the data access object, the CRUD file, I can just use find all, right? Why didn't I use the read method here? Because read is not going to be the one that I need, right? Web, this is slightly different. Here you want to select, let me just tell you what I mean by this. Let's say that someone would say, if you have a data access object that reads everything, right? You want to get all the blogs, right? So you can read all the blogs from the blogs table, right? So why did we use the find all? Why didn't we use just read? In your opinion, ليه شايفين, why do you think that we didn't use read here? Take a look at the name of the function. You have blogs, and we said that each blog is associated with what? With a single user, right? So this method gets you all the blogs for a specific user. You don't really need to read everything. Don't select star from the database. This is not what you want. This is equivalent in SQL to something like this. Don't freak out, it's easy. So find all logic requires a certain criteria, right? So we are trying to find all blogs for a specific user. Now we said that we have how many tables? We have a table for users, a table for blog. So if I did the join correctly, then I can say select everything from user, where the username from user appears in the author from blog. Right? This means that anyone, any author, any username who did actually have a blog is going to be returned by this inner join statement. فاهمين الكلام ده؟ تمام? So if we have all of the matches, any username who has an entry in the author column in the blog, right? If we have matches, then look up a certain username, right? So look up which username are you looking for. Right? This is the value that I'm going to get from the session object. Okay? So this is the current implementation. The user interface, we just added a couple of methods. So this is the user interface for the register, right? We take the inputs, we perform. This is a delegation function, right? So all that it does is that it calls register from what? From the logic object that we have created here via the composition. Okay? Same thing here in login, right? We have a couple of delegation functions and input taking functions, right? And logout. Okay, so we have take inputs for login, perform login, right, from the logic object, and if there is any flash message, just return it, right? Perform logout. This is another delegation function. See, it doesn't have any logic on its own. Okay, you want to check the current logged in status, right? So I just made a delegation function that grabs this method from the logic object, right? The same thing for get the current username, the current logged in username. Finally, we have the blog here. same user interface functions, create the inputs, take the inputs via a form from the web or from the terminal, and then perform the create post. This is a delegation that calls create post from the logic function or from the logic object. تمام. And then if this is correctly, then we're going to return a flash message. This is it. تمام. And this is to view all of the blogs for a certain user. So this is a delegation for what? For calling all blogs for a certain user from the logic object. تمام. So usually the user interface for you is just calling different methods. Nothing is done on its own, and it's returning flash messages. تمام. So before we continue, I think I've kept this in the second slide here. The user interface class seems vague to me. Before we go to the user interface class, let's take a look at the app.py because we added some stuff. You don't really need to care about the app.py at all. This is just a client for you, right? I created a bunch of classes in the back end and I want to test them. This is my testing. This is how I drive the implementation of the classes, right? So I just made a function that runs in the terminal that displays the option, right? First of all, this uses the user interface. See the client here, the main.py or the app.py? تمام? Does it need to import everything? Does it need to import logic class and data access? No. It just needs to import what? The user interface, which is essentially the only layer here, right? So the app.py is trying to access just one layer, not all of the inner layers. And we managed to do that by doing what, Jama'a? By including the following. If you take a look at user interface accesses what via this import? It accesses logic class and it creates an object out of it. So user interface have a copy. It contains a copy of the logic class inside of it. Take a look at the logic class. It contains also a copy from the data access, from multiple data access objects for 2 tables inside of it. So the logic class accesses data access and contains copies from it. Right? Okay. So looking back at the app.py, we only have one level of accessing. This is the function that displays the options, right? So I'm checking from the UI, from the user interface object on this function. This function, all that it does, that is, let me just remind you, from the user interface, right? It goes there, it checks the current login from this logic object. So if he is logged in, if he is not logged in, then tell him that he has only one of 2 options. If he's logged in, then tell him that he can log out or view or create a blog post. Finally, this is the options. This is the command based on the reply of the input. I'm going to be doing a certain thing. So CA for create account, LI for login in, and so on. And this is just a basic loop. Let me just tell you exactly what this maps to whenever we say user interface class. We don't really have this. Like in our implementation, where does this fit? Everyone is having starting to code to write classes for account, for expenses, but none of you created a class for user interface class. As a matter of fact, I'm assuming that you don't know where to fit the user interface class. Okay, so let me just draw a quick sketch. I'm going to keep everything here because we want to have this recorded session as a reference. Okay. So we said that we have the user interface class, right? And we have the logic class and the data access class, right? And we want to understand how exactly does this map to our implementation. Let me remind you what you have in your implementation. Either you are Flutter or Python. So in your implementation, remember that this is the client code. We don't really draw the client code because this is, even if this is a class, this is the client that drives the implementation. You don't put it in your class diagram. So I'm just going to say that this is my class app.py. In your implementation, you've seen something called route functions, right? So I think you have something, I don't know what is the name of the application, but let's just say that your script is called app.py, right? So in app.py, you have the following. You have a function that says maybe at this route, right? This is pseudocode. This is not Python. So following this route, if I go to the route that is called sign up, right? Do the following function, execute the following function, which is can be named the same thing, sign up, or sign up logic, or sign up logic controller, right? Depends. Okay. All right. Usually you have something to return, so you either return, you do some logic and return the page that you want to display. So return render template, right? And this is essentially your HTML page, and followed with any other object, any other pieces of information. Okay. So this is any data that you get from the database, whatever, and this is the actual HTML page or static page, depending on the type of the application. So this is the static page to be served. Let's say that this page is called signup.html. Okay. Now, in your application, in app.py, this is the app. Let's say that this is the file. Okay. What happens in the browser is that you go to the search bar and you say something like localhost and then /signup. Right. The second that you fire this signup route, right, on the server side, this is the server side, of course, and this is the client side. So this is the server side, the back end. Okay. Okay. So once you fire this, right, let's say that this is a form. I'm just going to fill in the entire thing, right? So this is a form that has a username input field, password, right, and there's a submit button or a register button, right? So once you fire this submit button, something called a post request, right, is going to be fired. Once you hit this submit button, right, a post request via this route is going to be fired to the server side. So this is a post request. Usually the post request handles or grabs every piece of data that is inside any input field, right? So it takes it with them. Okay. The post request is going to look for any function that has this route decorator. And the route, if the route matches, if this route that you defined here in the implementation matches the route that you are entering as an end user in the browser, this function beneath is going to be executed, right? And anything inside the function needs to be executed. Then, what you should be thinking of is that the logic inside here, let's say that the logic this here between the return and the function definition, this is the logic of signing up, logic of registration. Your task for this project is to make sure that this implementation, this logic that is being called, the logic that is being performed, is being fetched from other classes in the back end, right? So, so for example, if you have your implementation has something like this in the back end, then just make sure that whatever is being called is the following: logic class object dot register, right? And once we call this register, we are going to go to the back end, see where register is defined, right? Execute it, and that's it. Then we go back and perform the read, and we return the HTML page, right? And that's it. تمام? طيب, I'm saying this for one reason. Some of you have this keyword. It says app.py, or sorry, app.run, right? You have a script, obviously, that says that, right, in your Flask and Django and Flutter, right? And you have this route functions. So the script that contains route or dispatch or action, some people call it action functions, plus the server start command app.run. This is typically equivalent. This is equivalent to the UI. تمام? So the UI that I'm working on is the same thing. You take the inputs via the post request, right, to this function, you perform, you call the logic for registration from another class, right? You go to another class to execute it, and you come back with the result, right? So the UI class that you are working on is essentially the same as the app.py that you have in your implementation. تمام كده؟ يعني أي script, any script that contains route or dispatching functions that contains app.run, this is considered the user interface. we don't mean by the user interface static files. No. تمام. We don't really refer to HTML as the user interface. User interface means the ability to take inputs from the client, right, and perform some delegated logic. تمام. شباب انت معايا؟ So user interface just means انه احنا هناخد we take inputs from the user. Whether you take these inputs from the terminal, you take the inputs from forms from the internet, تمام? It doesn't really make a difference. This is the concept of the user interface. تمام? So to me personally, when I implemented user interface and the Amplify, this is equivalent to one thing in your application. It's equivalent to one script in your application. What? The Amplify. تمام? So just a quick recap on the relationships of UML. Right? Okay, so let's talk about association first. I'm just discussing the syntax. تمام? So association means what? Mean that we have a reference attribute. This is a class. The first part of a class is always what? The attributes, then the operations or the methods, the functions. تمام? So association means that we have a reference, a variable. Okay, this is the variable name, right? In one class. Inside this variable name, there is an object of a different class. Okay, so we are storing a reference, we are storing an object from a different class, تمام, inside a reference variable, inside a variable. This is it. This is association. تمام. So do you see anything like object B and parentheses? Do you see any object creation here inside this constructor? Do you see any object creation? فين? Where? Object creation means class and then followed by two parentheses. كأنك بتcall function. تمام. Calling functions ده كان في level functions. Calling classes is equivalent to creating objects out of a class. ف do you see any object created? هل شايف object B two parentheses بعد كده مثلا؟ No. صح? So this is not composition. تمام. If you see any parentheses, this is composition. Association is basically just injecting the parameter that you need, injecting the object that you need, and just store this object of the type B, for example, into what? Into a variable in A. So whenever we say that A accesses B, تمام, see this arrow here? This is the navigability. And navigability هنا, this is unidirectional. يعني if I have A, I can access B, but from B there is nothing that tells me that I can go back to A. تمام? So where do we send the object? So this is the definition. Okay, this is the definition of the association. Where is it actually performed? Where is it actually executed? In the client code. If you take a look at the client code, at the driver code, you create the B object, the one to be accessed first, and once we create it here, we store it in a reference, we store it in a pointer, in a variable, and then we send this pointer, this reference, as an injected argument into what? Into the object that is being created out of B. تمام? And then we store this A object in any variable. If you inspect the object A, you would see that it contains a reference, it contains a variable, and this variable contains an object of type B. This is just association. A variable, تمام? A variable storing an object of type of a certain type. Variable storing an object. That's it. تمام? And self depicts that this object is being permanently stored. So across any time, if I do any method, if I create any method inside A, any method is going to be capable of accessing this object B variable. تمام? So it is always with me. ايه؟ سيبك منها يعني دي بس يعني لما اجي اطبع مثلا الاوبجكت، لو عملت مثلا print B، عملت اوبجكت من B وحطيته في variable B، تمام؟ عايز انت تيجي تطبع B، صح؟ هيديك الشكل اللي انت كاتبه هنا، الكاستمايزد مسج دي. بس لو ما عملتش كده هيديك هيكساديسمال ادرس موجود في الميموري، فمش هتعرف تستفيد قوي بحاجه يعني. تمام؟ ما هو ده اللي انا قلته لك. ريبري دي معناها انه في اوبريشن بتحصل، الاوبريشن برنت. تمام؟ برنت لما احط كاريت اي اوبجكت من بي يا ماجد، تمام، واحطه جوه برنت فانكشن. البرنت لما تيجي تبرنت اوبجكت باي ديفولت لو ما فيش كده، تمام، هتطلع لك هيكساديسمال ادرس. تمام؟ هطلع لك مثلا بي اوبجكت، يعني بي كلاس مثلا، ان هو ده من نوع بي، بس ده الهيكساديسمال ادرس بتاعه. فاحنا عايزين حاجه تبقى هيومن ريدبل بس، فعشان كده حاطط اوبجكت بي بس، حاجه مش لازم تتحط يعني ريبريزنتيشن. تمام؟ So this is association. Another way of doing association, defining the association. تمام? So this is the association definition. We can take the parameter to be associated with A from the constructor, from the header. تمام? From the constructor header. تمام? برضو, you can take the same kind of object to be stored in this variable from any method defined in A, not only the constructor. So take a look here. We have another method that is defined in A. This time I decided that the constructor is not going to take anything. Look at the constructor of A. Look at this object created out of A. It doesn't take anything, right? But if you want to associate the object B that you've created to A, there is a method that you need to call separately, which is from A, add object B, and this is going to take this object of type B and then store it in a reference that is called, or a variable that's called object B. تمام? طيب. Although if you did something like this, I want you to be aware of the UML relationships because you need to mention them clearly. تمام? You need to understand associations clearly. تمام? And if you're using composition, if you're using something like dependency, I will know. And I will ask you, why are you using them? So you need to let me know that you understood why did you take a specific implementation for our relationship. تمام? There's a weaker type of association that is called dependency usage. What if the following is the scenario? Let's take another example here. Let's say that we have class J, right? And all that class J is doing is that contains a method. It's called useObject. تمام? This method does only one thing. It concatenates two parts to give you a full name, right? So it needs two pieces of information, which is the first name and the last name. That's it. The problem is that first name and last name, these two attributes cannot be found in J. But they exist where? In the K class, right? But in this situation, we didn't really, we sent the object K to J, but we didn't store it. Do you see anything called self.object K equals object K? We didn't store this permanently. I just needed two variables from it on the fly, and then I'm just going to throw it away. تمام? So this is the original syntax. A uses B. So I'm going to send an object of B to A, but if I don't really need it, I'm not going to contain self dot here. This means that this is just a local variable. Once the A object is created, this is going to be dead, right? I'm not going to see this object B anymore. So you need it for once. If you need it for one thing only, to do one thing only. تمام? This is another thing called the dependency usage. تمام? Do you understand this ولا نقولها تاني؟ طيب. ما عارف انا دي معناها ايه يعني مش مشكلة. Finally, this is composition. تمام? Composition means what? That you are creating. There is a class name followed by parentheses. This is a class call, just like functions. This is in functions you call it function call. تمام? A class call is just object creation. So if you see object creation inside the constructor, inside anywhere of a class, this is composition. This is an internal dependency. تمام? So composition, you create the actual object inside the class and store it in a reference. تمام? Right. So in the driver, we don't really need to create B outside and then pass it to A, right? Unlike the association here, right? Association, you need to create A outside, تمام? Create the B object outside, create the A object outside in the driver code, and then take B and send it to A via an external method or via the constructor like this. تمام؟ طيب. One final thing, I'm just going to mention something called the trade-off. تمام؟ So currently the implementation is composition. I'm going to refactor it into association, but before doing this, I just want to mention something. تمام؟ Dr. Ahmed in the design patterns, I think he mentioned the word client multiple times when he were talking about the design pattern. تمام؟ And you need to have a design pattern, at least one, to have the grade of the design pattern. The same thing with an architectural pattern. Have one architectural pattern implemented and you will have the grade for it. تمام? The more that you add to the architectural pattern, the more that you add to the design patterns, you will have a higher grade. I'm going to show you a simple architectural pattern that we can adopt for this class. تمام? It's way too simple. It's the layered architecture. تمام? The ECB is going to be attempted by the end of the lab, but I'm not sure that we are going to finish. But anyway, let's take a look at the supplier and the client mantra that we have here. So we have the user interface that has a component it created a component of the logic class inside of it. This is composition. So this essentially means what? If you take a look at the implementation of user interface inside the user interface, there was composition here. تمام? Class name parentheses a class call. This is composition, and you store this in a permanent variable depicted by the self dot. This is a permanent variable inside any object that is going to be created out of the user interface. تمام? So whenever we say that this user interface, this class is using this this other class, then we say that this is the client for this. تمام? يعني again, let's say that this class is using what? Uses logic class. Then this is considered the client for the logic class, the driver code, right? We write the driver code inside the user interface. So this is the client for logic class. Take a look from there. تمام? Whenever we say that the logic class here, this is the implementation. Composition, it contains an object created via composition from the data access, which is this line here, stored in another reference variable. تمام? This is called composition. And logic class is using what يا جماعة? Is using data access. معنى كده إنه logic class is the client for what? For data access. From the other perspective, you can say that data access supplies what? Supplies the object for what? For logic class, right? So if you take it from this perspective, this is the supplier too for the logic, for the user interface. This is using this, and this is supplied for this. The supplier appears in the imports above. تمام؟ طيب. Take a look at this code, and this is the internal parts of the system. This is the internal parts of the user interface, the logic class, and see the difference between them and the main client code. The main client code, as we said, it contains the route or dispatching functions. تمام? It contains the server, the web server firing command, the app.run command. تمام? So this is the main .py or the app.py. In the main .py, how many imports do you have? Just one, right? How many objects created? How many objects created here? شباب? One. تمام? For the app.py, the one that uses the entire system, you never need to bother about the logic class or the data access, because you know that if you have the user interface, the thing at the scratch, at the shell, تمام? If you have the user interface, you know that the user interface contains internally what? A logic class. You know that the logic class contains internally what? A data access. So all of this implementation or the control flow is going in one direction, from the app to the user interface to the logic to the data access. تمام? How is this good to you? Well, this is a trade-off. The trade-off here is that internally, right? Internally, on the internal components, we have tight coupling. تمام? If you have imports all over the place in your internal components, if you have compositions, this is tight coupling. تمام? يعني if this class for any reason did not find the data access, so in the folder you remove the data access, the logic class, whenever it runs, is going to just break immediately. تمام? So composition imposes tight coupling. تمام? On the other hand side, take a look at the app.py. We have increased something called the abstraction. تمام? By not exposing too much information, by not exposing all of the classes, just one class at the top, and it's going to let you in everything. تمام? So we increase the abstraction, we reduce the coupling. تمام? حلو جدا. Let's take the other way around. If we refactor this into associations, تمام? ايش الشكل المختلف؟ So ده كان composition، دلوقتي بقى association. غيرنا, we changed the relationship, we changed the link. So this is association and this is association. تمام? So take a look from here. Whenever you say that the logic or the user interface uses or accesses the logic class, تمام? Do you see any import يا جماعة? Do you see any import in the user interface? In the composition, we had the import. We needed the import because we are going to create an object on the spot immediately inside the constructor. But in this case, in association, everything is loosely coupled. يعني ايه loosely coupled يا ماجد؟ يعني in the user interface, you know for a fact that whenever you create an object out of the user interface, تمام? You know for a fact ان ايه اللي هيحصل؟ You are going to send an object of the logic class, تمام? And then once you inject this dependency, once you inject this argument, place it in this variable, and that's it. تمام? It relies on the developer on this part. The developer needs to know whenever he creates an object out of the user interface, is that you need to know that whenever you create an object of the user interface, you should be sending what? A logic object, not any type of object. تمام. So this is determined in the client, determined in the app.py. Okay, take a look at the logic class. تمام. In the logic class, it's the same thing. We have no imports whatsoever, so everything is loosely coupled in the back end. تمام. And we are sending or injecting a dependency via the constructor. This dependency can be an integer, a string, anything. The developer itself needs to determine that this is actually a data access object. تمام. So the trade-off, if you use association, it makes everything loosely coupled in the internal components. There is no imports whatsoever in the internal components because we are using dependency injection here. تمام. Association is dependency injection. تمام. But on the other hand side, take a look at the client code, at the driver code. This is equivalent to the same script that is going to be running your application. In this application, if you see way too many imports at the top, for example, it's fine. As long as you're doing in the internal, in the back end, there's no imports, there is no composition. But if you have composition in the back end and you have the entirety of the imports in the client, you're doing something wrong. يا كده يا كده. Either this or that. تمام. طيب. If you take a look at the main, the client app, the client code, we import everything. تمام. And then we create an object one by one. You start from the back, right? So this is needed. This needs to be supplied to the logic class. So we create an object out of the data access. We supply it to the logic class, right? And then this logic class needs to be supplied to what? To the user interface via this constructor argument, right? So we supply it to the user interface. And once we're done, the same execution, the same code execution is the same. These two lines are the same here. تمام? It is the system initialization setup. It's the setup part. This is the thing that is different. الكلام ده واضح؟ طيب شباب احنا اتفقنا انه ال report is going to be including this information. So I'm recapping on this just to make sure that you understand them. تمام. يعني there is going to be questions in the Viv. I don't want to drive everything to be regarding the mark, but يعني just try to understand this because this is going to be different for you. تمام. انت لو داخل اي شركه, if you're applying as an intern, as a junior, no one knows about this. Any junior level, not even intern, they are just working on something called CRUD environment. They tell them that to do I don't know, to do a read all, you select everything from database, right? Insert, delete, update. They spend months or maybe a year or two just doing CRUD operations, and they're fine with this. And no one expects from a junior to have more information than this. On a practical level, this is, it's going to be valuable information for you. On the other hand side, from the academic point of view, we're going to ask about this in the Viv. We are going to ask about this to be seen in the report. تمام. لو ده هيريحكم يعني. This is not the question. This is not the question. You understand this and you try to map it as much as possible in your code. تمام. Whenever you can refactor your code. Refactoring is not a phase, right? It's not supposed to be after you write the code immediately. Let's say that you are creating a class. You settled on the following. I'm creating the entire class. I'm creating all of the methods. Initial implementation. Commit this. This is the before version. تمام? Maybe the week before the submission or the 2 weeks before the submission, I'm going to open up this class and start refactoring. I'm starting adding architectural patterns, adding design patterns. This is one way to go. Some people would say after creating a single method in a class, I'm not satisfied. I'm going to commit this just to have a screenshot of it, a snapshot of it. And then later on, after implementing the method itself, I'm going to refactor it. This is also on the table. تمام? You will not be able to refactor until you understand how is the control flow of your application is running. Who is the client? Who is using what? Who is the supplier? تمام? This video is for you as a reference to look up. أنا هحطه على موضوع. Maybe in the report there is nothing clearly that, actually in the group report there is something, there is a note that I left for you as to talk about the control flow. It's an optional thing. If you want to talk about it, it's going to give you more marks. If you didn't, eventually you're going to be asked about it because you are going to submit a class diagram. The class diagram contains a flow. Any class diagram, like if I take a look at this class diagram, if I ask you what is the control flow for this class diagram, I'm going to say that following the lines here, right? So from this class, the object or yes. يعني take a look at this class diagram. حاول توصف لي كده anyone can anyone just يعني describe the control flow of this class diagram. What do you think? Describe the flow of the control flow of the class diagram. Whenever we create an object out of this, an object out of this, an object out of this, how is the communication is going to be going from which side to the other? Whenever you create the real objects بقى. الكلاينت تقصد بيه الاند يوزر؟ لا from the one who's using the class the library يعني اللايبرري دي اللي اقصد بيها المكان كله الكلاس كلها دي اللايبرري كل دي library. تمام ماشي اتفضل. تمام فماجد قال لك Magid said that the control flow is the following: user interface uses logic using that access. طيب let me ask you, how does user interface يعني uses logic class؟ ازاي بتستخدمها؟ how is it using it؟ تمام how؟ okay okay بس يعني let's just take this part here. How is user interface using the logic class implementation wise؟ لما اجي implement whenever I want to implement this piece of information اللي انت قلتها هعملها ازاي؟ فين؟ جوه اليوزر انترفيس. So this is composition ده مش association. لما تعمل ده بالظبط اللي انت قايله اكاريت لوجيك كلاس جوه هنا. ما انا بقول لوجيك كلاس بكاريت اوبجكت من لوجيك كلاس جوه يوزر انترفيس بس this is composition. المفروض يبقى يتسيف stored في اللوجيك. يعني take a look at this. I need to store a logic object in this variable. تمام. Same thing with association. I need to store the logic object in this variable. تمام. Whenever you decide on the right hand side to have it as an injected dependency زي كده, so someone other than the user interface, maybe the app.py, تمام, who's going to import the class and is going to create it, تمام, someone else is going to decide to send the argument, and once the argument is sent, once this object is sent, you're going to store it in this variable, this association, تمام. إنما composition, the difference is as well in the right hand side. In composition, you decide that I'm not going to let anyone mess around with my code. I want to expose as less as possible of information to the client side. So for the client, he's just going to import one line, one library, and create one object, and he will not be considered about sending any arguments to the function call, to the class call. تمام. فinstead composition on the right hand side, you decided to create the object internally inside the object, inside the class user interface. يعني الثانيه اللي انت بتكريت فيها user interface, immediately constructor يعني في اللاين ده بيعمل لك جواها ايه؟ logic class, بيعمل لك فيها object من logic class. امم في الاسوشيشن this is how it looks like. yes. لا يعني ايه يا مجد؟ مين؟ اهي هي دي اللوجيك. اللوجيك is on the other side. It uses, it's supplied by a data access object. ببعت لها ده مش مهم مين اللي هيبعته لحد دلوقتي. ده بليس هولدر، ده مش مهم بالنسبه لي. ده بليس هولدر ملوش فاليو لحد دلوقتي. ده الديفينيشن بتاع الكلاس. تمام. This definition has a placeholder. It doesn't contain a value. Yes, في المين I'm going to send a concrete بقى ايه؟ a concrete object of the type data access to the logic. تمام. I'm associating the concrete object اللي انا كريته وحطيته هنا ده to the logic class, and then I'm associating the concrete object that I've created from the logic class into what? Into the user interface class. تمام. فالassociation is just past يعني past arguments, injected arguments بس كده. انما in composition you would not see anything passed as an argument because everything is being composed internally. واضحة؟ طيب. I said this before and I'm going to say it again. Whenever you create a class diagram or you're just tiptoeing around the class diagram, come to me. I will help you in creating it, تمام? And I will help you in understanding the control flow. Yes, once. Yes. No. نو نو، كل واحد يختار يوز كيس، او حتى اختار نفس اليوز كيس ما تطلعليش نفس الاكتيفيتي دايجرام. اه ما تطلعش نفس الاكتيفيتي دايجرام. هو activity diagram it's just one activity diagram per individual. تمام، في الانديفيدوال ريبورت. تمام، one activity diagram. تمام، بس he's asking if multiple members chose the same use case to model as an activity diagram. I said that you can do that, but the activity diagram itself as a design needs to be different. For the same use case needs to be different. This is just in the case if you chose the same use case يعني. تمام. طيب, let's start writing some code. Let's refactor this into association. تمام. For the integration tests, تمام. We agreed, me and Dr. Ahmed, that شباب ركزوا معايا ثانية واحدة. For the integration tests, eventually في group report you are going to be asked to fulfill a certain testing category اللي هي CRUD testing. One of the categories يعني. تمام. هما 3 categories. تمام. Just have one implemented test على كل category. On each category I need to have one implemented test. So one of the categories is CRUD testing or database testing. We did this inside in an extra lab session يعني. تمام. And the code is on Moodle. The recording is on Moodle. تمام. So for this CRUD testing, ايه 6 or 7 6 تقريبا. تمام. For the CRUD testing category, CRUD testing will never be implemented by anything else. شباب, CRUD testing needs to be implemented by integration tests only. Only. There is no unit testing for CRUD. For CRUD files, you only integration test. تمام. So this can be your only integration test that can be implemented and put it in the group report. تمام. For the group report you need to cover, يعني انتوا هتلاقوكم يعني كفرتوها المفروض في اليونت. يعني individually وانتوا شغالين هتلاقيك كفرت مثلا التست الاولاني ان انت بتست ان في input field. You are testing that there is an input field in the a certain input field in the page. This is UI testing. The other category of the test is to test that there is validation. If I entered 100 digits in the password, so there is a validation. So you're just going to test that. One test is enough. Pick a single form. Pick a sign up form, for example, and do this test on it. No, this is going to be in the group report. For each category, we need one test. يعني مثلا for the category of form validation testing, one test. For the category of UI testing, one test. For the category of the CRUD testing, one test. For the individual, you need for every implementation a unit test. لكل بص يعني aggregate the tasks in one testing table and just create a test for it. تمام. يعني بص هو كود وايز هيبقى في سكريبت تيست سكريبت لكل كلاس. يعني انت لو عملت كلاس معينه او شاركت فيها، تمام، فانت هتلاقيك في التستنج فايل انت بتزود تيستنج ميثود لميثود انت عملتها يعني. individually في الريبورت وانت بتكتب الريبورت هو تيبل واحد، انما يعني انت مش انت بتعمل ميثود غير ده، يعني عمر بيعمل ميثود غير الميثود بتاعتك. انت بتimplement فانكشن، انت بتimplement فانكشن غير الفانكشن اللي هو بيعملها. يس. امال انتوا فاهمين ايه؟ ما هو كده. يس التاسك بتاعتك انت بتكريت فانكشن، الفانكشن دي كريت لها تيست. الفانكشن دي طب ميثود موجوده جوه كلاس، فاعمل الكلاس كلها هتبقى هي دي التيست للكلاس كلها. يس ايه هيبقى في تيستنج بروف على كاتيجوريز. يعني في الجروب ريبورت انا مش هقول لك هات لي يونت تيست ولا هات لي انتجريشن، هقول لك في كاتيجوري اسمها يو اي تيستنج just have a screenshot of the implementation. تمام صح. الانديفيدوال ايوه ايوه مظبوط. in the testing table, you do not need to take any screenshots خالص. In the testing table, let's say that you implemented adding expenses into expense tracker to adding expenses. 8 test cases الموجودة. A test case that can be something like input field should not مثلا take certain values, should not be taking strings, only digits. تمام. فايتس way too simple. يعني بص انا هقول لكم حاجه. Leave, this is a recommended thing to do for the current state of the semester, but this is not a good practice. Finish the implementation. تمام. Make sure that by week 10 you are done with the entirety of the implementation. تمام. Yes, the features. If you want to refactor, تمام. If you can't and you are really يعني it's tight in time ان انتوا مش ملاحقين اصلا انتوا خلاص الفيتشرز الاصليه. So just finish the original features by week 10. Leave week 11 for refactoring, adding an architectural pattern, adding one design pattern. تمام. And writing tests. تمام. فtests, design patterns, architectural patterns by week 11. The sooner that you start doing these refactoring and doing tests is the better. But this is يعني the worst case scenarios. Yes, 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 yes. Yes, 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 yes. تمام. طيب. Let's start writing some refactoring to transform the compositions into associations. So I'm just going to start from the first layer here. Okay, so let's just do this one here. تمام. تمام. This is fairly simple. So I'm just going to go to the user interface. I'm going to start from the start. تمام. So we have composition here. Now to transform the composition, بصوا هو هيبقى فيه flexibility يعني روم شويه، بس احنا مش عايزين نقول الموضوع ده official يعني. بس هيبقى فيه روم صغيره كده ان انت لو ما لحقتش تخلص كل حاجه وانت بتسلم الريبورت، لما تيجي البرزنتيشن في حاجات في الوقت ممكن تخلص في حاجات ما بين البرزنتيشن يعني between the presentation time and the submission time. If something was not fully implemented, you have still time to the Viv and come to us and tell us that this is the updated report. But the updated report should not include way too many يعني big additions. It's just bits that you didn't include. يعني what's really important is that to facilitate architectural patterns, to facilitate design patterns, at least one design pattern per individual. تمام. ممكن تخليها per group. لا هي per group. Okay. Yes, design pattern per group. Yes. يعني البروجكت كله ممكن the entire project can contain one pattern, one design pattern, two design patterns كده. تمام. Because there is the design patterns يا شباب. Design patterns is in the quality of modeling criteria. So this has a weight. In the quality of code criterion, this is the individual. دي اللي اتكلمنا فيها. This is where we talked about loose coupling, association, SR single responsibility, dry, كل ال principles دي. إيه؟ We're going to have the next lab to be إن شاء الله يعني. Yes, solution to a problem. Currently, we did not face any problems. By the end of this lab and the extra session next Wednesday, we are going to start talking about design pattern. We're going to just take two patterns inside the lab, factory and the abstract factory, and that's it. تمام. Things are easy, but I don't know. You should, if you're not going to apply it immediately, you do not have the room to apply it till now in your project. So what do we do? Do we sit like this? Of course no. يعني take the exercises that I'm putting to you here in Moodle and try to implement it just to make sure you're understanding the concept. تمام. مش عارف والله، بس يعني take the marking criteria. الدكتور منزلها على مودل اظن يعني. تمام. So let's refactor this into association. First of all, this is the composition. I have no need whatsoever to the composition, right? Let's say that composition is going to be removed, and I'm going to invent a dependency. This is how I'm going to associate the user interface with the logic class, right? So I'm just going to say logic. Let's just say logic object, right? If I have the logic object like this, we can just put it on the right hand side and boom, that's it. This is defining association. Actually أنا يعني I think this is slightly better, صح? طيب. So this is defining the association, right? This was composition, and we get rid of it. تمام? So do we need the import? I saw the message, but he sent the Dr. Ahmed mail. يعني I can't talk about this on my own دلوقتي. لو كان باعت لي لوحدي كنت صورت، بس هو بعت ميل دكتور احمد. في حد بعت ميل دكتور احمد قال له احنا في ناس مش هتيجي، فانا مش هعرف اعمل حاجه في الموضوع ده. So do we need the import here? Do you need the import in this class? It's association, so we don't really need the import anywhere. Okay? We needed the import when this was composition because I needed the exact definition of the class name. Okay? No composition, no import. All good. Okay. So let's go to the applet pie, the one that uses everything, right? So I'm just going to go to the applet pie like this, and let me try to accommodate the association that I've done. So see the implementation of the user interface. Now the implementation of user interface in the constructor, right? It requires a logic object, right? So this means that the point of creating a user interface object, you need to pass what? You need to pass what? A logic object. So this means that the logic object needs to be created beforehand. So let's just create it beforehand like this, right? Of course, this is going to throw an error because first of all we had a misspelling, and this is fine. But the problem is that we didn't even import. We need the import. So I'm just going to say from the script that is called logic class import what? Import logic class, and then you're going to see that this is working correctly. Now, once we create the logic object, I'm just going to name it as object like this, and I'm going to send it to user interface class. Right now, let's do the association level on these two parts here. We did the association between the user interface and the logic. Let's do the association between this line. Let's implement this line between the logic class and the data access. Okay. This is where the problems are going to appear. So let's take a look at the logic class. This is my client, the one that is going to be using the supplier, which is in this case the supplier is what? The data access. How do you know? Data access is being used here and there as well. تمام؟ طيب حلو جدا. Now we said that we are going to remove compositions and place it with placeholders. تمام؟ Replace it with placeholders. So I'm just going to say this is composition. Take this part away. Okay? Take this part away, right? And we need to be sending an association input. So this is defining an association. So this is a data access object. Data access, or let's just say data access object. For users, تمام? And we are going to do the same object for what? For the blog, right? Because we need to work on two tables here. We have use cases that does register, user exist, login. So all of these are what? The use cases for the user. And these are the use cases for the blog, creating blog and viewing or fetching all blogs for a certain user, right? So I need another object. I'm going to do the same thing. This is composition. No need for this. Let's take this part away. And let's place this here. But this is the data access, the CRUD object for what? For blogs. Now we need to continue this by associating the constructor of this class with what? With the data access, right? We don't need the import anymore. No composition. So the question here, how do we do this, Agama? How to associate two things, two suppliers, or two objects to the same class? Because we need a data access object for user, this one, right? So we need a data access object for blocks. This seems to be the solution for this, right? Is this correct? هل الكلام ده صح? Is this correct in your opinion? You need to operate in two tables. The first table is the users table. So I'm just preparing a data access object that is going to be created elsewhere, right? And I'm preparing another data access object that is going to be created outside this class. I'm sending both of them what? This method, to this constructor. But my question is the following: is this the correct way to go? ليه؟ No, بس ليه? Why? Let me ask you something. Let's say that we have now, we are talking about only two classes so far, or only two domain objects, only two tables. The two tables are what? The user table, right, via this use case. So register and login, essentially referring to what? The user table, right? So for a table in a database, you need to have what? A CRUD file, a CRUD object for it. تمام? Same thing. These two are referring to what table? Which table? Are referring to which table? The block table. So we need to have a CRUD object for it. What if you need to work on more use cases that need more tables? تمام? What if we have a use case that talks about subscriptions? So we need to have a table in the database called subscription, and we need to create a data access object for it. تمام? What if we have messages, a class or a table that does messages? You need a CRUD object for it. تمام? A CRUD object for comments as well. So is this logical to you, said that every time you need to insert more use cases that depends on more tables to just be يعني doing commas all over the place in the constructor and injecting all of these dependencies infinitely? أكيد لا. صح؟ The answer is this is no, right? صح كده؟ طيب. So what is the solution? What is the alternative? If we have multiple CRUD يعني objects and we want to يعني inject all of them to the logic class, we want to associate all of them to the logic class to be able to access all of the tables. So here I'm accessing the users table, I'm accessing the block table. If you want to go this path, the only way to do this is by having a list to be sent. Yani instead of all of these arguments being sent in the constructor, I can just say that I'm sending a list. Just say data objects or DA data access object list, right? And this list is going to be having indices. And for you as a developer, the one who wrote this implementation, انت هتبقى عارف, you would know that if I did something like this, right? If I did something like data access object list of 0, this refers to what? To the user table, right? If I did the same thing but for 1, this refers to what? The block table. But this is not readable at all. Okay? Anyone is working on the same class other than you, he will never understand that these indices refer to actual tables. Okay? So this is our entry to talk about domain objects. This is where we should definitely, instead of containing every single use case that you have in your system in a single class, here we are going to talk about that these are going to be extracted into user class, block class, subscription class, and so on. Okay? Talk about domain objects. Let's just discuss really quickly what is a domain object. A domain object is essentially a thing, right? Or a concept. It can be a person role, it can be an object, a concept, an event. Okay, so just to make sure that you are understanding this, the domain thing, and you can extract it from your project idea. If we talk about something like an e-learning system, how many domain objects do we have? How many things that you can characterize to be as its own class? عندك, you have something like Moodle. How many objects domain objects do you have in Moodle? How many things that can be characterized? تعرف توصفهم وتعرف تديهم operation. You can give operations to them. Messages. صح. إيه? So this is a class. Another class, what? What can you do in Moodle? Courses. Courses. This can have attribute and operation. This can have attribute and operation. إيه تاني? What else? Assignments. Let's say assignment is the same thing as a submission. في exam. في إيه تاني؟ في أنت. وفي أنا. تمام. Grades, we can say that grades is an attribute of exam. تمام. So if we want to map each description to each one of these domain objects, which one of those are a person or a role? Which one is an object? Which one is a concept? Which one is an event? Okay, so this is a role or a person. What else? Event. صح. انت قلت event؟ Yes. تمام. ايه تاني؟ Yes. تمام. So if you want to make sure that you are on the right track while creating your class diagram, try to extract everything from anything that can have attributes, anything that can have operations. What kind of operation can you do as a student? You can log in, you can sign up. So what kind of operation can you do for on an exam? You can enroll to an exam or start an exam, view an exam, right? Or view your grades. What kind of things you can do on a course? Let's say something like Coursera, for example. You have the ability to enroll to the course, right? View the material of the course. تمام? طيب, going back to this. So we understand what are domain objects. From a UML perspective, domain objects are referred to as classes. تمام? From a database system perspective, domain objects are referred to as entities. So in a database, domain objects are the same domain object, the same thing is going to appear in the database as a table. This is referred to as an entity. تمام? The same domain object in the class, in the UML class diagram, هيبقى اسمه ايه? It's going to be called as what? A class. تمام كده؟ طيب. There is a golden rule. I think I mentioned this to a couple of your groups last time. If you have three tables, let's say that you have a table for user, a table for person, and a table for a car in the database. Make sure that in your back end, تمام? The database area, the storage area is what goes after. This is after the back end. So before the database area, before the storage, you have what? You have the back end. So if you have two tables in the back end, in the database, in the storage, person and a car, create person and a car class in the back end. So this kind of one-to-one mapping is just going to kick off your implementation. تمام? So this is how things look like, and we decided to add the following. We decided to add post name, stuff related to a use case related to creating the blog post, post name, post title, author, and so on. And this is creating the post. All of these are in one place. When we tried to refactor this into association, this was very impractical. We decided to refactor everything to domain objects. تمام? By doing the following: by extracting the things that relate to the user or the account and putting them in a domain object or a class called account, and extracting anything that is related to the block and putting them in something called block. But by the end of the day, account is going to be accessing the account table, صح? So this means that I need a CRUD file to access the account table for the user, and block is going to be accessing the block table from the database, صح? So I need a CRUD file for the block to access the block table. Are these concepts clear? حلو. تعال بقى نريفاكتور. So let's start by سيف, انت جيت متأخر ليه؟ طيب انا مش هحاور عليك, بس انا مش هاخدك اتندنس. تمام, عشان بس لو قاعد مستني الاتندنس انت جيت متأخر قوي. انا عندي كاباسيتي ان انا استحمل اتليست لحد نص ساعة 40 دقيقة. تمام. طيب. So let's create a class. Let's call it account, and let's create another domain object that is called what? Let's call it a block. Okay. Let's extract from the logic class whatever we want to put inside the account, right? So we need these things. First of all, let's create a class by the name of the file. And this is going to be having a constructor. Okay. This constructor, this account, take a look here. The account is going to need what? An object from data access. It needs to use the CRUD file, right? So this needs to be supplied into the signature of the constructor, right? This uses the data access. The one that is being accessed needs to be visible in the signature. Okay. The one that is being accessed, the supplier, needs to be visible in the signature of the constructor. So I need to say that I will receive a data access object for the users table. تمام? From where, I don't care at the moment, but I know that I'm going to receive it. تمام? Look at them. Let's say that after we receive this data access, the entire thing is going to be the same. So I'm just going to take everything from here. Okay? This data access object, I'm just going to rename it like this. تمام? And this is my data access object user. I'm going to read everything. So this is the entirety of the rows, all of the rows inside the table. And we can take away this part for the blog. We don't really talk about the blog here, just the account. Okay. Now let's take the register, user exist, and log in, and all of these things, and put them inside my class. I think, did I copy things twice? لا هم دول register, user exist, login, and so on. تمام. I think this is it for my account class. صح كده؟ Let's just go to the blog.py, do the same thing, do the constructor. And let's say that the constructor is going to take the same thing. The constructor, the account needed what? The account needed a CRUD file, a CRUD object. The blog needs to access another CRUD object to access the blog table. صح? So we need to supply a data access. This is the access side on the arrowhead here. تمام? The same thing, I need to supply another data access or CRUD object to your blog. And let's name this as blogs. تمام كده? Let's take the attributes related to the blog from here. And let's take the use cases. We have essentially two. Okay. So what is left is that we need to run يعني read all of the values from the blog, from the CRUD file via the CRUD file. So this is your, we need these two lines here. And this is the injected argument. Okay, so this is the injected argument. We need an equal sign, and we're good to go. صح كده؟ حلو جدا. Let's try to test this. تمام. This is association, and we agreed that in the app.py, just going to have this here, we are going to need everything. So I'm going to remember the trade-off. We talked about the trade-off. So in the app.py, I'm sacrificing with the app.py. I don't care if the app.py has so much coupling, but what I care about is that take a look at the internal components. Do you have any imports? Do you have any object creation? Do you have something followed by parentheses? Any class followed by parentheses? No. No composition. No imports. So this is loosely coupled. This is loosely coupled. تمام? So we're good to go. Okay? But this is obviously loosely coupled. So I'm just going to take the data access and import data access. And then I'm going to say, I'm going to create a data access object. تمام? A CRUD file to access the user, the JSON. And I'm going to name this as data access users. And I'm going to do another one for my blog. So, and this is going to be accessing the blog.json. Maybe I didn't show you this, but I have prepared a blog.json in the folder here. تمام. Once we have the data access data access users, associate this with your logic class, right? Sorry, we don't really need the logic class, صح? We don't really need the logic class here. خلاص. We have account and we have blog. مظبوط? So we need to import, instead of this, from account, import account, and from blog, import blog. We create an account, and you say that the account expects a data access object, and this is where we actually are going to connect and link things. This is where things are going to be concretely defined. At this point of time, this is the definition. The definition just contains a placeholder. This placeholder can be named as x and x, right? We don't really care about the placeholder that is being passed. What I really care about is that whenever I pass it, I need to pass it correctly of the correct type. So this is where the passing happens. I'm just going to say that I will pass the data access object users, right? And I'm going to store this in account object, and then I'm going to do another one for the blog, right? And this is going to take the blogs like that, right? And then we need the user interface. Notice something. The user interface accesses how many classes here? 2. The account and the blog. this maps to what in implementation. يعني in implementation, what should I do to make this happen? What should I do to say that the user interface accesses two classes? See, the one at the arrowhead side here, this is the supplier. So this means that this needs to use it. This means, think of it reverse in reverse manner, right? This means what? That if this is accessing this, this means that this is an object being sent to this. So this means that in the user interface, maybe we didn't really refactor this part. Yeah? In the user interface, I should expect what? An account object being sent to me. We don't really work on the logic object anymore. So account objects, right, is being sent to me like this. This is equivalent to the first association line here. The other one here, you see that the user interface uses what, or is associated to what? The block, and the arrowhead is on this side. This is the accessed, right? So this means that there is a block being sent to the constructor of what? Of the user interface. So I should prepare another space and send what? Block object. صح كده؟ قلت كده ولا تمام ماشي. We have another permanent reference, stored reference, and just name it the same thing, just to reduce the ambiguity. Okay, we have these two things. We're good to go. Now take a look at our functions. We didn't modify everything, so let's start the modification from. I know that there are going to be errors, but let's just take the user interface. Okay. So if you take a look at this, we just take the inputs. So this is equivalent to taking inputs from the form, from a web page. We perform the register. So the register used to be called from a logic object, which we don't really have anymore. But we have it from where? This is existent on an account object. So if you looked up any account object, you should see a register method inside of it, right? So we should refactor this and this and this and this and this into account object. Okay? Now let's take a look at the block. Okay, so this is the inputs you take from the web, from the terminal. No one cares, right? Here we have the check logged in. Check logged in is a method actually that is existent on the account here. So we need to put this instead of logic to be account object. Tamam? And creating the blog post. If you take a look at the blog by after the refactoring that we did, any blog object that is going to be created out of this class is going to contain this method. So I'm just going to put this logic object to be as the blog object. So this method can be found from my blog object. Let's continue. Check logged in, the same thing, is going to be found from an account object. Get all blogs for a user is going to be found from a blog object. Let's have a leap of faith and try to run the app. It's going to be يعني throwing errors unless يعني أمنا ضيعنا. بس في حاجة هنا غلط. There's something wrong here. We should be creating a blog object, صح كده? And the user interface by the end of the day should expect two things, which are an account type object and a blog type object. So this is the account type object, and this is the blog type object. تمام? Crossing fingers, run, and let's see the first error. No, it didn't really run. Okay, so this is the first thing, right? So let's say creating account. So let's enter the first username, which is Faris. Okay, this error is just an assertion error. يعني هو المفروض this is the form validation equivalent that I did on the terminal, right? Let's do this one more time. So your account has been created. Let's just check this in the, where is it? User.json, and we have this one here. تمام? Let's go back and try to log in. I think I have one prepared here. Okay, so we are logged in. We can see the one logged in here. So the login is working correctly. Let's try to log out. Yes, it is working as well. So let's log in again. Right? Let's try to create a blog post. Right? So CB. Let's say an amazing title, an amazing content. تمام? And there's an issue. let's see where is the issue. So the problem is at line 18 in create blog post, which is inside blog, right? So let's have a look here. Create blog post, if you noticed, it uses what? There is a username that is using it. Where is the username? This is the username, right? But this is not going to work anymore because ليه بقى? Why? ليه ده مش هينفع? Why is this not going to work? بالظبط. I don't have currently anything that says self.username in my attribute. And I know for a fact that self.username ده هيبقى فين? It's going to be there فين بقى? It's going to be existent in which class? In which object? Account. شباب, account. This is an account, right? So now blog doesn't really have what? Blog doesn't really have access to self-username. Okay, so I think it's worth it to say that there is a line between the blog and the account. We need this kind of association. Why? Because this is the only way that I can say that a primary key from the user is going to be existent as a foreign key in the blogs, one to many. The primary goes from the one and sits at the many side. تمام? So we need to have this association. So I've created this beforehand. I'm just going to show you how this is going to look like. تمام? So you can use anything, not only Visual Paradigm, any tool that you want. This is the more flexible tool, the most flexible that I found on the internet online. تمام? For the account, we need to have a link, and this link is unidirectional, meaning that the blog, the mini site, is the one that should have a reference to the account. تمام؟ شباب, do you know why is this reference is considered to be, خلينا نعملها هنا. Why is this reference is considered to be, why is this navigability is considered to be unidirectional? Do you know why is it important to be exactly just unidirectional? يعني if I did this يعني bidirectional, let's say from the blog currently, see this guy here, this is my this is my reference, this is my association, this is the indication on association. تمام? That's okay. So this line, or this part right here, this is the variable, this is the permanent variable, and this is the account type that I'm storing here. Right? So this is association. By looking just at this line, without looking even at the arrowhead, right? I should know that blog can access account via what? Via this variable, via this account object. So this is an account variable containing a value or an object of type A, of type account. Type. Do you see anything on the other hand side that says that you have bidirectionality? No. In the account, you have no variable that is of the type A, of the type blog. So you cannot يعني, access blog from account. تمام? طيب, if someone decides to make this bidirectional, صح ولا غلط? Right or wrong? To make this bidirectional. This is wrong. Let's see why is this wrong. والكابل ده اتغير ولا يعني مش عارف لما الناس اللي ما بتبقاش عايزه تيجي ما بتجيش بيشطح. طيب let's just go to where is it? Scripture. Let me just remind you quickly of how one-to-many, why one-to-many relationships, whether you are using NoSQL or SQL, needs to be only unidirectional. Let's say that we have a one-to-many relationship. I have a part on my screen that doesn't work, so this is one-to-many. Oh my god, one-to-many. Okay. Let's say that we have orders and we have customers. Right? خلينا نعمل دي هنا. تمام. Let's sketch a couple of information. Let's say that this table contains what? A customer ID, contains what? Name, contains I don't know, maybe email, right? And this is the one side, right? So one customer can place multiple orders. صح؟ مظبوط؟ والorder can be placed by one customer. Okay, so this is the table. Let's give some information. So this is 1 and this is 2. This is Paris and this is في حد اسمه صغير ياخد المكان ده عمر. تمام. So we have 2 persons. ماشي. Let's take a look at the account or the orders table. This is the mini site. Okay. So this is the order ID. This is the CID. This is the OID. Okay. Let's say that this is, I don't know, maybe the order quantity, the item number, and the price. Let's just say that this is the price, total price. And finally, I'm going to leave this column right there. تمام. So this is the first order ID, 100. This is the second, 200, and this is the third, 300. This guy purchased 10 items, this guy purchased 90 items, and this guy purchased only 2 items. تمام. The price is something irrelevant, so I'm just going to leave it like this. تمام. Now let's say that the one who bought, تمام, you remember the rule? Remember the rule that we talked about? The primary key from the one side appears as what? As a foreign key in the many side. صح? So this is the primary key from there. So let's put it here. تمام? So this is the CID. Okay? So let's say that user ID, okay, the order ID of 100 and 200 is bought by Faris, which is ID of 1, and the 300 is bought by one, by who? The other one, which is Omar, which is ID of 2. تمام? طيب. This is unidirectional for this reason. ماشي? This is unidirectional because you can only see the orders that someone has placed, تمام, from the orders table, from the many side. تمام. Think about containing a column that has the orders, تمام, or the order ID. Think about this. Just try to reverse it. تمام. Let's say the one who bought Faris, who bought 200 and 100, is going to be including these two values. فهتلاقي نفسك بتعمل ايه؟ You will find yourself adding multiple values in a column, and this is prohibited in databases. تمام. Multiple values are not accommodated in any row, in any cell. تمام. Same thing with Omar is going to be having the 300 ID. تمام. So it can never be bidirectional. One to many is always unidirectional. Make sure that it is intended to have an arrow. شباب, if you have a class diagram that is drawn like this, تمام, person and car, تمام, this is what? Bidirectional or unidirectional? Bidirectional. If there is no arrowheads on any side, this is bidirectional. This is unidirectional. This is bidirectional. يعني كأنك عامل كده, كأنك عامل arrow هنا وarrow هنا. تمام. It is equivalent to having arrow on both sides. So if you want to depict that it is unidirectional, make the arrowhead appear on a single side. Okay. So this is the association. I'm going to create an object, a reference, a variable of account object inside what? Inside block. So inside block, I'm just going to say self dot account object, and this is going to be passed as well to what? To the block, right? So I'm just going to say account object. I don't care who passes it to the block, but it's just being passed, injected there. I'm going to take it and I'm going to use it. تمام? So here in the username, just make sure that you access this username from this account object, and we're good to go. صح كده? And there's another username being used here, so just let's just change it like that. تمام كده? So let's try to run this. Yes, we changed the definition of the block, but we did not reflect this on the call of the block. صح? So calling the block here, or creating an object of the block, we should say that this takes two things. So it takes the same account object that we have created beforehand. Now let's run this. Again, let's try to create a post. Test title and test body. So this should be created right now. So let's just go to blog.json, Control S, and you should see Halag has this one. So this is the first row or block. This is the second, and this is the third. So let's try to view them, or VB like this. So this is my, because I'm logged in as Halag, so this is my blogs like that. تمام كده؟ حلو جدا. Let's talk slightly about architectural patterns. And before we factor into layered architecture, I think this is the easiest thing that you can do right now in this case, in this phase. In the next lab, it's going to be really heavy, تمام? And I really want everyone to be there inside the lab on Wednesday. we're going, yes, the extra one. We are going to talk about ECB, and we're going to talk about something called interfaces, and we talk about something called abstract classes. ماشي. These things are just يعني parts of the object-oriented language and any object-oriented language. I just want you to facilitate them, to use them as much as possible in your code. Once you understand them, the usage is really, really simple. Right? If you are using MVC or ECB, I'm going to tell you exactly how to use ECB. So you can take what I do and just implement it in your application. تمام؟ طيب. So let's refactor to layered architecture. تمام؟ يا رب بس يعني نلاقي وقت نعمل كده. So really quickly, I just want to have a sketch. مش هقلب ولا حاجة يعني، بس عايز اوريكم sketch سريع كده. So when we talked about layer architecture, do you remember how many layers did Dr. Ahmed talk about in layer architecture? وشباب, in some architectural patterns like the ECB, entity, controller, boundary, أو the MVC, model, view, controller, تمام? You should be aware that there are rules that governs how to use these patterns. يعني في حاجات معينة ممكن تحصل. يعني for example, you see this implementation that we did on Lucy chart here, right? One can say that I'm going to have a link from blog to account. Does this work? If you need to do it, there is no patterns. I'm not following any patterns at all at this point. So this is viable. This is valid. The second that we say that we are following an architectural patterns, something should not be connected to each other. Example on this. See this user interface? This is a boundary, right? This is called boundary, or this is just the client. This is the client side. And the data access is related to the database, to the storage. So if you have a link that goes like this is immediately يعني, a cut in your mark. So there are rules that governs the architectural pattern. Some classes should never be connected to each other. You should never create an object out of the data access and pass it, right? And pass it via the constructor of this class. ايه؟ مش بالضروره، انا معدي على اللوجيك عشان اليوز كيس بتاعتنا ماشيه كده. لكن في architectural patterns هتلاقي ان الكنترول فلو هيمشي لك بنفس الفلو اللي احنا عاملينه، بس في حاجات ما ينفعش تكلم بعض. زي مثلا الفيو ال HTML pages او الانبوتس اللي من ال HTML pages should never be accessing what the database. تمام؟ It should always صح. It should always go to a certain middle tier layer. تمام؟ So let's just really quickly discuss the layers. Do you remember the layers from layer architecture? دكتور احمد هيسال في الكلام ده، لما يسالك في حاجه يديك حاجه في المحاضره هيسالك عليه في البرزنتيشن. وانت المفروض لما تعمله هتفهمه. بس let's just mention the layer architecture really quickly. We said that how many layers do we have, or at least in the lecture. صح. حد فاكر هم ايه؟ persistence او storage. صح. We don't really care about the storage because this is يعني if you have any files for database put in this layer. But the one above this is what? ايه؟ ما تتكسفش قول. business logic layer صح كده. user interface او it's called path presentation and تمام كده. هو بص بيقول لك انه السورس does not really appear in code. مش بيظهر. It's not going to be apparent in your code base, but it is just saying that this data access doesn't really make sense to be there on its own. يعني لازم يبقى في حاجه تحتها بتاكسس منها. So this is the reasoning behind having the storage as a layer. تمام. Let's implement the layer architecture. The key in implementing the layer architecture is the following. هي كلمة واحدة. It's just one word. It's going to make everything really clear. Layer equals folder. These are layers. Let's create directories. بس كده. تمام. So let's create a directory here. Can I change the theme because أنا حاسس إن أنا يعني الكود أول مرة أشوفه لما بغير الثيم كده. طيب. I'm just going to close everything. Now let's create the layers. I'm going to create in the root directory. a layer called presentation, a layer called, sorry, um, business logic layer. You can actually add the suffix. And كان في ايه تاني؟ that access layer. I think this is all what we need, صح؟ Now, what goes where? Remember our talk about what goes where? This is essentially the part where we needed it. تمام؟ بس متأخر شوية في الفيلم. But anyways, um, I'm just going to, I don't know if I can do this ولا لا. بس أنا مش عايز، أنا عايز shape. يعني I just want to say that the shape. So this part is what? Yes, this is the presentation. So this is your presentation. بس صح. Any use cases يا جماعة. If you want to know what is a use case, go quickly to any يعني empty sheet around you and create something that you've seen before that is called what? A use case diagram. This is how can you tell. على فكرة, we are going to use case diagram to help us in extracting controllers in the ECB. تمام؟ So it's just there. بس مش هنعمل. بص, انت ممكن تحط folder اسمه storage. You can place a folder called storage in case you have anything related to, maybe you have sql.db, a file that for the database. But that's not necessary. But if you want it, if you have a database file, could create a folder, a layer for it called storage layer or persistence layer. تمام كده؟ So to know the exact use cases, just create a use case diagram and say the first one is what? Login, register, just to make sure that you are on the right track, صح? And the things that you are putting, the classes that you are choosing to put inside your business logic layer are correct. تمام? We have create post, صح? Create blog post and view blog post. مظبوط? These two are part of the which class? Which domain object class? Sorry, blog. And these two are part of the domain object class, which is a account. تمام كده؟ طيب, so going back, we can say that this part is what? Business logic layer, BLL. This is another abbreviation. تمام. And finally, this is your data access. الكلام ده صعب؟ الكلام ده easy and we can accommodate it from now on. دلوقتي حالا في الامبلمنتيشن بتاعنا ممكن نعمله كده. الحاجات اللي ورا دي لا انا اعملها عشان ابين لك. انت ممكن تعمل shaded, يعني ممكن تعمل ديزاين كده, يعني اعمل مثلا, I don't know if we can color this ولا لا, بس if you want to color this to add a background and just shading اللي هي this shaded area is the data access, this shaded area is the business logic, this shaded area is the presentation. تمام. و to emphasize again my presentation, my user interface, my boundary, my view from MVC or ACB is not the static files. It is not HTML. It is any function, it is any route function that we use to grab the input by via post request, via any kind of HTTP request. تمام كده؟ طيب, تعالى نكمل الكلام ده. Have something at 3, صح؟ طيب, I'm just going to place the account inside business logic. No, what? this احنا في حاجة بترن behind the scenes. أول مرة أشوف الحاجة دي. Yeah. I was going to do this. No. I was going to do this in my own, but يعني Visual Studio Code is saying that if you place this here, he's going to يعني do something like this. He's going to add or prepend the folder that it is contained within. تمام. Let's take the logic and the data access. Okay, and finally the user interface like this. شباب, usually in your implementation, I think most of you by now have seen a folder called templates. مظبوط. Templates is the folder that contains بقى the static files that contains HTML. Maybe you have something called assets برضو. هيبقى folder اسمه assets، يعني folder تاني كده بيبقى اسمه assets. بس the idea is that you need to add anything related to the presentation، سواء كان route functions، تمام، أو if it was route functions, if it was static files, it was styles to be contained with the layer or the folder that's called a presentation. ف assets is the one that should have your style، تمام. But I don't have any of these, فأنا just going to delete them. أنا بس بفهمك يعني. Yes. تمام. And if Django is forcing you to, because Django is really annoying for the customization. If you cannot customize how to tell Django that you are going to find the views in presentation inside templates, just come to me and I will do it for you. تمام. So this is the update. تمام. I think when I run دلوقتي هيديني error، فعشان كده I'm just going to skip this. You understand the idea, so once we do this kind of layer architecture implementation thing, we implemented architectural pattern دلوقتي حالا without doing any other thing. This is the default architectural pattern اصلا اللي موجود يعني without يعني modifying the code. The only thing that is going to be modified to the code via this architectural pattern is the imports. تمام. ان انت تقول that you're going to find this script inside this folder and so on. تمام. الكلام ده تمام. طيب كويس. الناس اللي خرجت عشان بس نشيلها من الاتندنس.